So ladies, thank you so much for joining us today, especially during this time when our nation has been rocked with all kinds of things going on, as we all know what they are, so I don't need to get into them. We will a little bit in this discussion throughout, but I want to talk to you a little bit about the Women2Women National Conversations Tour. We travel the country engaging women in candid and frank conversations about issues that are important to all of us. I've had the pleasure of meeting many of you in person, and fingers crossed in the fall we can get back on tour, and I hope to meet many more of you. It's important to keep the conversation going. So during this time, when with the pandemic, we've been doing a lot of web calls. So thank you again for joining us today. We've had amazing topics and amazing panelists. We have covered so many topics. The last one we did was staying sane during this time, which was very enlightening. I learned a lot of things. So without further ado, I want to move on. We have three amazing women today joining us on just a great topic. I could take the time to introduce them, but I could not do them justice. So I am going to let them introduce themselves. Neeta, could you go first and tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure. Good morning, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to join you guys from Houston. And I'm Neeta Sane. I'm the founder of the Aspire Network, which I founded about 8 years ago when I was in serving in a public office as trustee of Houston Community College. I was the first generation immigrant elected to that office, and I noticed that that institution really lacked diversity and inclusion initiatives, and I really made that one of my top priorities, and I launched the Aspire Network focusing on diversity and inclusion. And so along the way, last 15 years, I've also been managing my own business. I'm a business owner. And I own a management consulting firm, basically focusing on business strategy planning, execution, and coaching. My educational background includes an MBA in finance and accounting from Florida Institute of Technology and Master of Science from University of Houston, Clear Lake. And along the way, I also got a certification, life coaching certification from a Life Purpose Institute in California. And so it's been a exciting journey. I've been involved in the community a whole lot, hosted several initiatives, all of them focusing on diversity and inclusion, whether it is for women, it is for youth, whether it is leadership. And so I'm really excited to join all of you ladies and see what comes out of this discussion. I'm really looking forward to learning from you all and sharing my perspective. So thank you so much for having me on this call.
Thank you, Neeta, so much. Dee, could you please tell us a little bit about your background, please?
Sure, thank you. I am also very pleased to be here, honored by the invitation. I am with Diversity Council. We're based in Minnesota, epicenter of a lot of what's going on now, though I would say Houston is definitely an epicenter, Texas and Detroit as well. We do our work in 3 areas, and they are the realization of civic equity, educational equity, and health equity. And it's kind of been my career and my life's work, focused on women and girls, minority populations, and others, really on that full spectrum of human identity. I did my undergraduate work in Colorado in sociology and communications, and my graduate work in public administration and nonprofit management, and have built a lifetime of work in looking at the effects of our diverse identities on equity and our ability to thrive.
So Dee, thank you so much. And Darlene, can you hear us?
Good morning. I can. Thank you so much.
Okay. Could you please tell us a little bit about yourself? And
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm Darlene King. I am the Executive Director of the Michigan Diversity Council, which is a chapter of the National Diversity Council. I have been in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion for a little over 20 years now. I started when it was just diversity and no inclusion and no equity. And my primary role with the council is working with corporations, whether they are for profit or nonprofit, and helping them to understand the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion and access. And so I provide consulting, support, training, and development, along with an enormous amount of coaching and conversations with C-suites and board of directors around the work and how it impacts organizations from a corporate responsibility, employee engagement, and community engagement perspective.
Thank you, Darlene. So let's get started. Let's just jump right in. With programs designed to increase diversity and inclusion in the workplace often fail. So it leads to the natural question, what's actually working? So our first question is going to be for Neeta. Given the current emergence of the new rhetoric in the field of diversity to now replace with inclusion, can you explain to our audience the difference between inclusion and diversity?
Absolutely, and it's a great question from the definition standpoint. Usually, diversity and inclusion, these two words are used in tandem, but these two terms are distinct in its definitions. Let's say diversity. Let's talk about diversity first. It's all about the demographic. It focuses on the what. What is the demographic, or what is the makeup of the demographic in terms of people? You know, different people, different backgrounds, their age, race, religion, culture, ethnicity, socioeconomic backgrounds, and the list goes on and on. So it is all about the different backgrounds, and diversity focuses on the what aspect of it. Inclusion, on the other hand, I shouldn't say on the other hand, it goes hand in hand with it, but still, inclusion is about appreciating and acknowledging all these differences. And it ties to the respect and dignity for differences that we have based on the race, religion, and culture. And it involves creating an environment and culture where we all feel appreciated, welcome, and respected with all our beliefs, assumptions, and differences that we bring to the table. So those are the definitions, and it's ideal to have diversity and inclusion as one unit so that it can be successful in the workforce and in education arena, in our personal and professional life.
Thank you, Neeta. So Neeta just gave us a definition and the differences between diversity and inclusion. So Darlene, are you finding that organizations are having difficulty in understanding the definitions?
Absolutely. Organizations have been having a challenge with understanding the definition of inclusion for years. And I'll take it a little bit further than what Neeta, and kind of add on to her. You know, although inclusion is the respecting voices and ethnicities and getting them engaged and feeling valued, the real component to that is the engagement and having them have an opportunity to have a voice and also have a seat at the table where they are a part of the planning, implementation, and execution process from the boardroom all the way down to environmental services. And companies are really struggling right now. I've spent the last month and a half since the murder of George Floyd, just really having some really candid, very transparent and open conversations with board of directors and C-suites, helping them to understand exactly what that means and what that looks like. Because for a number of years, they have not been necessarily focused on inclusion. And so they are struggling by leaps and by bounds. But I will say that due to the new protests that are going on across the world around racial justice and the dismantling of systemic racism, more and more corporations are finally leaning in to figure out exactly what that is and what it looks like. I know for us, although we have over 600 corporate partners that we work with in helping them to navigate through this work and what it really looks like and how to get it to be impactful, not only from an internal perspective, but an external perspective. There are thousands of organizations and corporations that have not even launched a DE&I initiative within their organization. And part of the reason for that is because they don't know how. So it's so important for individuals such as ourselves that's on this panel, plus others that are in the profession, to be able to help them navigate through what that looks like, because inclusion is the work. It is the serious hard work. The diversity is work as well, but it is not as hard as inclusion is. So there are some challenges surrounding the whole entire process.
Thank you, Darlene. So, Dee, I've talked to a lot of the people, a lot of my friends before I did this call. And I'll tell you, a lot of people misunderstand diversity. They think diversity is based on race, which we know isn't true. How do we go about educating our community on best practices for inclusion?
Yeah, and I will build on what both Neeta and Darlene said. So diversity is a state, right? It's things can diversify on their own organically, right? Our communities, our populations are diversifying, and you can diversify things on purpose, right? We want to diversify our board of directors to better reflect the community, but that isn't the sweet spot, right? Just diversifying doesn't mean you're going to change effects until you take on the inclusion work and really are intentional about including people, about honoring people. So if you think about it as a community, you want to get to equity. We want to get to pluralistic spaces where everyone participates. And that means participating in both the design of and the benefit from policy and practice and social contract. And I echo what Darlene said about so many organizations coming forward now, corporations, businesses of all sizes, stepping up and saying, okay, we're ready. We want to do something. We recognize that there are things going on that we need to address. And there is economic value in creating equity. There is economic value in diversifying and in being inclusive. And so that the main piece, I think, in terms of best practices for communities or organizations really is to involve every voice in designing or redesigning the systems, the structures, the policies that are in place, and looking at them through multiple perspectives. I came to Minnesota from Colorado because there's a lot of growth going on, and we know there are huge disparities in the northern Midwest. Some are actually the worst in the country in terms of economic disparities, educational disparities, financial disparities. So how do we look at our systems which work incredibly well for kind of the dominant culture and recast them to work better for everybody? And so we have taken on a commitment to act. We have currently about 70 to 75 organizations, from as large as Mayo Clinic based in Minnesota, but they have 65,000 employees, have signed this commitment to act, to small businesses with as few as 5 employees. And it has 3 stages to it because we don't want to hand people solutions. We want people to develop their own solutions. And the 3 stages are first to listen, to kind of pause in what you're doing, look around you, listen internally, listen externally, and maybe think about some of what you do differently by listening. And then learning. So then do some deep diving. Look at what is going on in your industry. What are some diversity, equity, and inclusion things going on within your industry? Where are there some best practices? Who is leading? And then creating some action steps that reflect a change in yourself organizationally, right? A shift in your leadership's position on diversity, equity, inclusion work, and a shift in integration into community. So, you know, best practices at its heart are about, at their heart are really about connecting with community and changing that dynamic, or within your organization, connecting with everyone, and then doing some work and looking for, you know, looking outward, turning outward, and looking for voices that haven't been part of the conversation to date.
Thank you. Darlene, how would you go about creating effective D&I programs?
The very first thing, you know, to piggyback on Dee, one of the major, most important components of initiating D&I programs within an organization is that you have to have senior leadership buy-in. You have to have C-suite buy-in. If you don't, then all of the efforts are going to be for naught. They are going to fall flat and they are going to fail. And so that is the very, very first hurdle that you have to get over. You cannot start in the middle. You cannot start at the end. It is amazing to have champions within the organization that can assist in the process of getting the ear of senior leadership. But if we go in to work with a company and work with an organization, and that leadership does not see the value, they do not see the business case, they don't understand the impact of sustainability and the impact that it has on profitability, then we back out because the work is not going to get done. And so that is our very first initial approach, is that we have to have senior level buy-in in order for us to be able to come in and begin to engage with looking at their organizations and looking at having the opportunity to help them through the process. Survey and assessment is huge. Having the opportunity to really hear what the rest of the organization feels and thinks about diversity, equity, and inclusion are some of the very, very first steps in order for us to be able to share with the senior level leadership, because what they may think it is may not necessarily be what it is once they begin to engage the voices and the opinions of the rest of the organization. So those are the very, very first steps in how we go in to be able to start that process around this work, because you have to be able to do some education around it. It's kind of like having a teenager that says, hey, mom or dad, I want to drive the car, give me the keys, but they haven't had driver's training yet. Exact same principles apply here. You need to be able to, after obtaining that buy-in, be able to educate those senior leaders on exactly what this work is about, so that they will know how much commitment they have to dedicate to it. You have to dedicate finances. You have to dedicate people in order to actually do that work. And so the first steps are education, understanding, and senior level buy-in. Once we're able to obtain some of those things and incorporate it in the initial stages of the strategy, then we are starting to begin to get on the journey of really, really being impactful in the space of DE&I. And so that's our approach relative to having some really successful and impactful programming within corporations and organizations around the work.
Well, thank you. This
Darlene,
question,
I am nodding so vigorously with you on all of those points, especially, right, the resources. It
Yes.
can't be lip service. You need to put the resources in. You need to dedicate the FTE. You need to say to the entire organization from the leadership point, this is important. We're prioritizing it. We go through that same process, and I can't tell you the number of times we've talked to an organization, we've gone through, they've said, we're ready, we really get it. And then towards the end of the conversation, they say something like, now, how are we going to fit this into our already busy lives? Where do we carve out the 15 minutes? And we're like, no, you know what?
Nope.
Not going to work. It's
Yeah.
not carving out the 15 minutes. Yeah.
No.
so Dee, I'm going to ask all of you this question. I'm going to start with Dee, put her on the spot here first. So obviously you found leaders that absorb this and are really good to work with, and then you found some that are not. What characteristics do you believe are needed to be an effective leader and to really embrace this?
So I'm going to say that there are a few things that are critically important. The first of which is emotional intelligence and empathy. People have to feel the empathy, but then they also have to understand that there is economic advantage, right? That we create better companies, better communities when everyone participates. And you have to have both aspects of that. You have to be a credible leader, and it takes both of those things. Understanding the human value and understanding the economic value, both in good measure, in order to lead into this space. And we work with some large companies, so Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota, and we say to others, there's a reason that Blue Cross Blue Shield is doing this work so thoroughly at every level of their organization. And that's because they know economically, right, that they need to do a better job of connecting with their clients. They need to understand their policyholders and the people they interact with. And they need to, if they're going to sustain themselves in a changing workforce environment, they need to understand and connect better with their employees. They're not going to survive otherwise. But they are doing both things very authentically, understanding the economic purpose and engaging around empathy and seeing the deep value of engagement, connectivity, and inclusion.
Thank you. Darlene, what do you think?
One of the things that I really think is leaders have to lead inclusively. It is so important for them to understand what that looks like and what that means. It is one thing to say, I am going to identify an FTE as a chief diversity officer to oversee the work within itself. But it is not okay to say, I am going to identify this chief diversity officer and then I'm just going to let them run with it. No, that's not how it works. We need for you to lean in literally. We need you to understand what inclusive leadership looks like, which is very different than departmental leadership, which is very different than looking at leading, the IPO or leading the operations of the organization as a whole. And so leaders have to be able to understand that leading inclusively is a whole nother dynamic than what they are accustomed to. And that you have to be able to work with and alongside your chief diversity officer or your diversity manager that's actually out there doing the work and being engaged in the work. Again, the majority of this responsibility offset and even throughout the process is about inclusive leadership and being intentional, because if you are not intentional and you are not leading inclusively, then the spirit of trust is lost. And that's what this work is all about. It is about gaining true, authentic trust. And you're not going to be able to do that if you don't lead from an inclusive, intentional perspective.
Thank you. So Neeta, as an educator, I'd like you to answer that question and also tell us, are there classes, are institutions offering classes now and courses that focus on this to make leaders more effective with the D&I program?
Yeah, absolutely. And Darlene and Dee, and you brought up an excellent point of the engagement. Uh, all the educational institutions have been focusing on increasing D&I programs for the workforce, for students, for faculty, for staff. And diversity has been talked about a lot in the educational arena. But again, the inclusiveness and the engagement part of it has been a struggle. What all activities really bring people together? By understanding each other's different perspectives, cultures, ethnic differences, and so on and so forth. So when I was serving on the board of HCC, the one thing that I pushed for is to have different kinds of activities and engagement processes to make D&I program effective. And one thing for the workplace, actually these three programs that I've been proposing all these years really work in workplace as well. Having communication and trust building activities, having an open dialogue, whether with the management or project team members or within your groups that you're working on, whether you are in a public sector or private sector. You got to have open communication and trust building activities to understand each other's differences, where we are coming from, what our perspectives are, because all based on the beliefs and assumptions and how we were brought up, and it carries forward in their own lives. So just having that respect and communication activity, that is crucial. Socially, of course, we try to have more interaction through foods and cultural activities, music, international festivals, and that kind of brings people, students, faculties, or even people at the workplace, bring together in a more relaxing way. And more they open up and they listen to other people, and that trust can be built just through that activity and interaction. The other thing I have been pushing for is the curriculum change. Educationally, we got to train our students from K through 12. So beyond, even before they come into community colleges or universities, we miss out on the portion where education is really falling short from the curriculum standpoint, which is not really diversified. We do need to educate and expose our students early on from maybe grade first all the way through K-12, 12th grade, about the global traditional events. What are the innovations and what are the histories around the world? How did this word came about, rather than focusing on just one geographic region, talking about the histories of one region or inventions or scientific advances made in one part of the world. It limits students' abilities to understand the global perspective, and that D&I part kind of gets left out in K through 12 systems. And just, couple of examples like history and science. These two curriculums really need to be revamped to include histories around the world, scientific innovations around the world. And that's a start educationally. And I really appreciate, Darlene, you bringing up about the education. It starts from the education, but it gets talked about only at a higher education level. And I think we are missing a huge point by not discussing D&I activities for K through 12 public education systems. So that's kind of my take on that, Sarah. But to answer your question, yes, there is a trend and there is a desire, but it's been a struggle from the inclusion and engagement standpoint, even in the educational arena.
Thank you, Neeta. This next one I'm going to ask Darlene, but Dee and Neeta, please feel free to add your voices to this as well. This is a tough question. A lot of my female friends have asked that I ask you this. Approximately half of all discrimination and harassment complaints lead to some type of retaliation. How do we change the environment in the workplace? Because once you file a complaint, oftentimes they're held back. You know, they face mental anguish, you know, harassment, even more harassment by their colleagues. How do we fix this, which is such an important issue that this country is facing today?
It is such an important issue, and I so appreciate the question. Again, it lends itself to organization changing its corporate culture. That question is surrounding culture. And there are so many organizations that are deep and knee deep and neck deep in horrible culture, in culture that is literally designed to exclude Black and brown people. There are cultures that are literally in place that allow micro and macro aggressions to happen and to go on a regular basis. When we talk about this work of being intentional, and we talk about this work of being inclusive and incorporating more diversity within our pipeline, we cannot do all of this work but have the same level of culture that we have had within the organization. You know, when we talk about education and I look at the training and development around this work, two basic, very fundamental trainings are bias. And I hate to use the word unconscious all the time because sometimes it's not unconscious. Oftentimes it's implicit. It's known what's happening and what's going on, and that's where micro and macro aggressions kind of come into play. And then there is cultural competency, really understanding what that means and how bias plays a role in the lack of cultural competency and changing the landscape of the culture. So one of the main things that can definitely be done, and that has to be done in order for this work to be impactful, in order for companies to understand the importance of profitability and creativity from diverse voices and groups, is really being focused on shifting the culture. Because if you don't shift the culture, the lunchroom conversations, the water cooler conversations, the after work event conversations, and actions still occur and happen. This work is not about changing people's hearts, which we ultimately hope that will happen. Personally, myself, I like to leave that part to a higher power, but
I agree with you.
You know what I mean? On the
Yep.
flip side of it, it's about changing behavior and what's going to be acceptable and what's not going to be acceptable. I have to commend the presidents of one of our corporate partners. His name is Sandro. Sandro is the president of Flagstar Bank. When Flagstar Bank began to embark upon this work, Sandro made it very clear to all the Flagstar banks across North America that, hey, if you feel that you can't get with us changing our culture and us engaging in this work intentionally and accurately and changing what we do internally and externally, I will gladly write you a recommendation letter to go somewhere else.
Wow.
It's inclusive leadership, okay? That is what you call not leaning in, but jumping in. So you have
standing up.
Yes, it is. You have to change the culture, because if you don't, It's not going to happen. The other piece is that you have to sometimes use people as an example. If they feel like they want to be discriminatory, if they feel like they want to engage in harassment because of someone's ethnicity or race or sexual orientation or whatever the case may be, then your organization may not be the place for them to be. But if you as leaders continue to tolerate the behavior and say, okay, we're just going to give you 3 days off, or we're going to suspend you for a week, or we're going to send you through
More boys will be boys, right?
Absolutely. And that's all we're going to do. Then you are helping to be a part of the problem and not a part of the solution. So some real hardcore decisions have to be made about shifting and changing the culture in order to change the behavior.
Okay,
Yeah,
well,
and it's
and
the same, Darlene.
Mhm.
It's the
go ahead.
same with communities. So organizations and communities, what will you tolerate, right? What are we going to tolerate in our contract together within a corporation or a contract together within a community? What types of behaviors will we tolerate? And we set the climate. It isn't dictated by anyone else, but it's dictated by those who are within. And so, and we can look at our own failures in terms of this work and the failure to address climate or culture. If you look at affirmative action, so we took a step to mandate the diversity side without creating the spaces within organizations for people with different identities to thrive. And that's what we have to shift here. We have to say, as organizations, as communities, we are going to shift because we need everyone to thrive, everyone to participate together. And you're exactly right, Darlene. It comes from leadership. What are we going to tolerate? You can think what you want, be what you want when you're outside our doors, but when you are here, you will abide by these norms. And then that has to be owned by everyone and enforced by everyone. And then you don't have people who come forward with a complaint and find themselves, doubly or triply victimized by the organization or by the culture, by the systems. So
So,
important.
Absolutely.
We step in. We've seen it, but
Yeah, and I would love to chime in
every
on that.
Yeah.
okay, go ahead. This is Sarah. Go ahead. Who wants to chime in?
Yeah, I would love to chime in quickly on that one. I think the culture and the climate change, one more aspect the leaders can consider is focus the conversation on competence. Competence at the workplace, like how is every individual in a team or a project team is performing from the work standpoint? What is the productivity or as per the job description? And the focus, when it goes on competence and productivity, the discussion shifts away from the cultural and any biases that could be out there. So that is one thing. I wanted to chime in that another aspect is to focus on the productivity and the competence of a person, regardless of the differences that socially, culturally that we have. So that's kind of one point I wanted to quickly chime in on that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize that is less about how people, but what do they accomplish, right? The what.
Exactly.
What do they accomplish, and less about the how, right? Because that's where our differences come in. The how we approach work, the way we get to the end result. If we focus on the end result and stop programming or dictating as much of the how, then people who are differently abled, people who have different cultural norms and different work norms, if their production level is what meets our criteria, then we are all winning.
Well, thank you, ladies. Obviously, we have another topic for another discussion here that could take the full hour, but we have lots of questions from our listeners. So, Cecilia, why don't you go ahead and start asking the women the questions?
Absolutely. Our first one says, it's from Sandy. Our question is, Our organization is located in a very white community, but our mission and funding is meant to focus on serving disadvantaged groups. Currently, all of our employees are white, but we are actively working to hire with the intent of becoming more diverse. In your opinions, what are some important steps in ensuring the new hire will feel welcome, and what should we do and what shouldn't we do?
This is Darlene. Can I please? So, very quickly. One thing about this work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are so many different components to it. There's veterans, there's LGBTQ, there's women, there's disabilities, there is outside of your racial and ethnic groups and individuals within your organizations. Going back to the culture piece, you have to be able to even begin to have the conversation with your employees that are all white, even surrounding the appreciation of those other groups that are not necessarily groups that focus on racial ethnicity and equity. Because again, it's about beginning to change that culture. It is also very important to know statistically, when you hire, increase your pipeline of minorities, when they look to the left of them and they look to the right of them and they don't see anyone that looks like them, 9 times out of 10, they're going to leave and it's going to be a revolving door because the culture is not even appreciative or accepting of them being involved in that organization. So for you all, it's going to have to be a, kind of like a double dutch, old school. You're going to have to be juggling two things at one time. You're going to have to be juggling changing your culture and getting your employees within the organization to understand that diversity also is not just inclusive of race and ethnicity, but it is also inclusive of these other components so they can begin to appreciate that concept while you are bringing in your diverse employees. So then even if in the beginning they don't see anyone that looks like them or sounds like them from the left or to the right, they can at least feel included, feel appreciated, and see that the culture is inviting to all within that regard.
Thank you. Cecilia, the next question.
Yes, our next question seems to be for Neeta. It says, Neeta makes an excellent point. I personally believe in teaching young minds about different cultures. I strongly feel that international cinema can be very useful. I am not talking about the Slumdog Millionaire genre, but movies based on real societal issues. Neeta, have you thought of movies as a tool for diversity inclusion or know of any examples? Thank you for your time.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and thank you for your question. And movies would be an ideal component to be included in the social festivals or international festivals where international films can be incorporated into that interaction. That is an excellent point. Yes, we tried to do that, but it is costly. It is, it requires a lot of resources. And we'll see if we can get some sponsors or some resources, because in public education institutions, there's always an issue about the budgets and a lot of shortage of resources. So we tried to do as much as we could with minimum budget, and but incorporating the cinemas and movies would be ideal. Maybe I'll definitely take it further and explore that option. Thank you so much for bringing that up.
Can I add a quick note?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, so this is Dee. We use film from an organization called Community-Based Film out of Boston, and they produce lots and lots of short videos that are that are community members talking about their lived experience, whether they're immigrants or whoever they happen to be. And it's a wonderful tool, especially for youth, to hear from an individual their personal story. So I'm just throwing that out, that's a wonderful resource.
Are they available online?
Yeah, I think if you, they're on our website, but also if you just Google community-based film, they're out of Boston. They have just great resources.
Wonderful, thank you. Cecilia?
Yes, our next.
I know you have more questions.
So many questions. Next question, it seems to be general, but whoever can answer best, I suppose. Is it illegal to ask your race on a job application? I know we now have an opportunity to say or not to say, but I feel like those applications are automatically disqualified. Any advice?
So it is illegal. You know, you can have voluntary questions regarding race, but you can't apply them to your selection process for a candidate. They are only to be used as you look at who you're attracting through your recruitment methodologies. And really, you want to erase any indications of identity as you select candidates. You can, however, recruit by saying, bilingual plus, or bilingual candidates will be selected, or other things. You should clearly put in your recruitment information that we are, we want to create a diverse and inclusive workforce. Minority candidates encouraged to apply, those kinds of things. But you can't make your selections based on some aspect of a person's identity.
Thank you. Cecilia, I think we have time for one more.
Okay, wonderful. Darlene mentioned survey and assessment of the rest of the organization after having the C-suite buy-in. Are there particular surveys or assessments that she recommends that might be most helpful? And if not, what things should be included in this survey and assessment?
Great question. And so it is, I always recommend to companies and organizations to seek the assistance of a third party organization or entity that is versed in this work. Because it is going to garner more honest answers. It is going to, those entities are able to craft questions that are designed to have people answer them in order for us to be able to help the C-suites as they begin to craft a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. And so to have someone to just conduct a survey, say HR, for example, it is very different than this work DE&I, because HR usually is surrounding compliance. They want a yes or no answer. There's no gray matter in between that process. In this work of diversity, there's a lot of gray. There's never just black, or there's just never just white. Because there's so much gray, you want to ensure that someone that is versed and crafted in developing surveys around this work to garner the answers that you need to be able to craft it. So that would be my recommendation, is to seek the assistance of some professionals in the space that are able to create these surveys and the assessments, so that they can then gather the data and share the data most appropriately, which is going to direct you on how to develop your strategy.
Agreed. And I think there's a couple of additional reasons. One is there are people this is their expertise. And so why step away from your own expertise to move into this space? And you want to be able to ensure anonymity as much as possible, so that you do have that safe zone that Darlene mentioned. People are not going to say to HR something that they would say to a neutral third party who can protect their identity.
Yes.
So unfortunately, our time is up. So I want to thank Dee and Darlene and Neeta for joining us today. We could go on hours and hours with such an important topic. But that
would be fun.
I know we can do this again. And I also wanted everyone listening, I want to thank you for joining us. I want to remind you that this has been recorded, and you can find it in all of our social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. And while you're there, please be sure to follow us. So we'll look forward to our next webinar. And again, Dee, Darlene, and Neeta, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you, Sarah, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Appreciate it.